Walking catfish. When people picture an invasive catfish, they usually imagine something big and predatory, a giant flathead or blue cat pulled out of a southern river. Florida has a stranger example than either of those. Walking catfish are native to Southeast Asia and became established in the state after escaping from aquaculture facilities in the 1960s. They get their name from a genuinely unusual ability. Using their pectoral fins and a wriggling body motion, they can move across dry land for short distances, sometimes crossing between entirely separate bodies of water on their own, without any flooding or connecting waterway involved. That ability comes from a specialized organ that lets them breathe air directly rather than relying purely on gills, which also means they can survive in stagnant, low-oxygen canals and ditches that would be uninhabitable for most native fish. In Florida's dense network of drainage canals, that combination, mobility across land plus tolerance for poor water quality, let them spread through the southern part of the state remarkably fast after their initial escape, well beyond what a typical aquatic invader could manage without human help. The ecological problem isn't really predation on large prey, the way it is with some catfish. Walking catfish are opportunistic feeders that take small fish, invertebrates, and the eggs of native species, and their presence in a pond or canal system tends to correlate with reduced numbers of native forage fish. Florida has had them established long enough now that eradication is essentially off the table. Current management is aimed less at removing them from where they're already entrenched, and more at slowing their spread into watersheds they haven't reached yet, because unlike most fish, this one doesn't need a flood event or a connecting channel to get there. Mobility on land is a strange enough advantage. What comes next is a fish that solved the same basic problem, access to new water, in a much more conventional way, by simply being moved there deliberately. Blue catfish. Blue catfish are native to the Mississippi, Missouri, and Ohio River basins, but they were deliberately introduced into Chesapeake Bay tributaries in Virginia decades ago as a sport fish. That introduction has since become one of the most closely studied invasive fish problems on the East Coast. They're the largest North American catfish species, with some individuals in introduced populations exceeding 100 pounds, and they're broad, opportunistic feeders. Blue crabs, menhaden, shad, and effectively anything else they can fit in their mouth. In the Chesapeake specifically, that diet overlaps directly with species the bay's fisheries depend on, and researchers have found blue catfish now making up a disproportionate share of total fish biomass in some of the tributaries where they were introduced. Their tolerance for a wide salinity range is what let the population expand as far as it did. Unlike a purely freshwater invader, blue catfish can move between upriver freshwater and the brackish lower reaches of the bay, which opened up far more habitat than a typical introduced fish would have access to. What makes them especially difficult to manage is that same appeal that got them introduced in the first place. They're genuinely good to eat and grow to trophy size, which is why several states now run commercial harvest incentive programs specifically aimed at pulling blue catfish biomass back out of the bay. It's an unusual position for a fisheries agency to be in, actively encouraging harvest of a fish that, in its native range, would be managed as a protected sport fish instead. Blue catfish got that competitive advantage from size and salinity tolerance. The next species on this list is arguably even more dangerous to native fish. Flathead catfish. Flathead catfish are native to the Mississippi River basin, which puts them in the same native somewhere, invasive elsewhere category as blue catfish. Outside that native range, particularly in Atlantic slope rivers like the James, the Santee Cooper system, and parts of the Chesapeake watershed, they've become one of the more aggressively managed invasive fish on the East Coast. What sets flathead apart from most other catfish is what they actually eat. They're built as ambush predators, with a broad, flattened head and a mouth capable of taking surprisingly large prey. And unlike a lot of catfish species that scavenge opportunistically, flatheads strongly prefer live prey. That distinction matters ecologically. Introduced flathead don't just compete with native fish for food the way a generalist scavenger would. They actively hunt them. In rivers where native sunfish, shad, and other species never evolved alongside a predator built quite like this one, flathead introductions have been associated with sharp declines in those populations. Size compounds the problem. Flathead grow large and live a long time. Individuals over 50 pounds aren't unusual in some established populations, and fish can live well past a decade. A predator that size, hunting live prey, with over a decade to keep doing it, has a very different long-term impact than a smaller or shorter-lived invader would. That combination is why several states actively encourage anglers to keep and remove any flathead caught outside its native drainage drainage, rather than practicing catch and release the way they might with a native game fish. The usual conservation instinct gets reversed entirely. Predation is the clearest kind of invasive threat because it's direct and visible, one fish eating another. The next species causes just as much damage without preying on anything at all. Armored catfish. Armored catfish, often called suckermouth catfish, or simply plecos by anyone who's kept one in a home aquarium, are established in parts of Texas, Florida, and a handful of other warm water systems after repeated releases from the aquarium trade. Unlike every other species discussed so far, they're not really predators at all. They feed mostly on algae and organic material, scraped off rocks and submerged surfaces, with a specialized sucker-like mouth, which sounds relatively harmless until you look at what that feeding behavior does to a riverbank. Several species dig extensive burrows into soft banks for shelter and spawning, and at high densities those burrows can destabilize bank structure enough to accelerate erosion, a documented issue in Texas's San Marcos and Comal rivers, both of which support endangered native species that depend on stable, spring-fed habitat. The threat here isn't a mouthful of teeth, it's structural engineering, one burrow at a time. In a place where the riverbank itself is part of the habitat something else depends on. Their armor plating adds a second layer to the problem. Bony, overlapping plates make them extremely difficult for native predators to eat, removing one of the normal checks that would otherwise keep an introduced species from establishing so completely. And they tolerate a wider range of water quality and temperature than most native fish in the same systems, which is why warm water discharge areas, particularly around power plants, have become reliable places to find large, dense populations, even through winter months, when the surrounding water is too cold for them everywhere else. Black bullhead. Black bullhead are native to a large stretch of the central United States, but they've been widely introduced far outside that range, into parts of the West Coast, the Pacific Northwest, and various isolated watersheds, mostly through historical stocking and bait bucket releases, rather than any single deliberate introduction. They're small compared to most fish covered here, rarely exceeding a couple of pounds, which makes them easy to overlook as a serious invasive concern. What actually drives the problem is tolerance, rather than size. Black bullhead can survive low oxygen, high turbidity, and brief periods of near freezing or unusually warm water, conditions that push out more sensitive native fish entirely. That tolerance means they don't need pristine water to thrive, so they can persist and reproduce in habitat already degraded by other stressors, compounding damage that was already underway, rather than causing a new kind of problem on its own. They're also prolific breeders. Females guard large numbers of eggs and newly hatched young in dense schools, and once established in a small pond or isolated stream, they tend to dominate the available forage and habitat quickly. Reversing an introduction at that point usually means draining or heavily treating the water body entirely, since the fish itself isn't the kind of predator or engineer that a targeted removal effort can easily outpace. Channel catfish. Channel catfish are native to a huge stretch of central and eastern North America, but they've been introduced so widely outside that range, through both intentional stocking for sport fishing and unintentional spread, that in a lot of western states and parts of the Pacific Northwest, the fish anglers are catching didn't evolve anywhere near that water. What made them such an easy sell for stocking programs is exactly what makes them a problem once introduced. They're generalist feeders, capable of eating insects, crustaceans, smaller fish, and plant material without much preference, and a fish that grows to a respectable size, fights well on a line, and isn't picky about food, is close to an ideal choice for a state fisheries program trying to build a new recreational fishery from scratch. That same flexibility lets them outcompete native fish for food across a far broader range of conditions than a specialist predator could manage, and in some western river systems, channel catfish introductions have been linked to declines in native minnows and other small fish that never evolved alongside a predator this adaptable. What makes channel catfish unusual on this list is that the introductions haven't stopped. They're simultaneously a valued, actively maintained sport fish in some watersheds and a documented ecological concern in others, sometimes within the same state, sometimes in the same river system, depending on which stretch of it you're standing on. There's one more species worth including, mostly because leaving it out would make this list feel incomplete, rather than because it causes damage on the same scale as the others. White catfish. White catfish are native to Atlantic and Gulf coastal drainages, but they've been introduced well beyond that range, including into California and other parts of the West, mostly through historical stocking programs decades ago aimed at establishing new catfish fisheries. They're smaller and less aggressive than blue or flathead catfish, generally topping out under 10 pounds, and their diet leans toward invertebrates and smaller prey rather than the large-bodied fish some of their relatives target. That makes their ecological footprint footprint noticeably smaller than a species like flathead or blue catfish, but they still compete directly with native bottom-feeding fish for food and habitat. And in some California waterways, they've become established enough to support their own dedicated recreational fishery, which complicates any future management decision, since removing an invasive species is a much harder sell once anglers have built decades of tradition around catching it. Their spread has also been slower and patchier than most of the other species here, largely because they were introduced into fewer distinct watersheds to begin with. But where they have taken hold, white catfish tend to persist indefinitely, since nothing about the introduced ecosystems seems to meaningfully limit their population once established. It's also worth acknowledging that this isn't necessarily a complete accounting of every non-native or out-of-range catfish ever reported in North American waters. Isolated releases of aquarium species like red-tail catfish or occasional Wells catfish reports turn up in angler accounts from time to time without ever becoming genuinely established populations. The 7 species here represent the ones with documented, self-sustaining populations and real ecological consequences, which is a meaningfully different bar than simply having been caught once outside an aquarium.